Good evening, and welcome to Dusty Feet. It's what June 9th, so we're quickly approaching halfway through 2022. Crazy, huh? Okay, so tonight we have two takes on the test at Mount Sinai. Uh, this is an interesting one, and one that we haven't. We talk about having different opinions here. This is where those different opinions get to be talked at by the guests that we're having, which I think is a rarity and will be enjoyable. So we'll get into that this evening. This will be a ton of fun. And don't forget, in the description below are links to all of the audio, video, and source documents that we use here on the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, the learning we do here does not happen. So be sure to click to subscribe. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God, interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some Bible Project on the Dusty Feet. So this is good. This should be fun, okay, but challenging, and it will be because you're going to have to think a bit on this one. Uh, I applaud the people that we're going to be talking about tonight, or talking with, or they'll be speaking tonight. Will be Tim Mackie, John Collins, and Carmen Imes, and their discussion on these two takes is really, really good. But I'm going to try something different than we've done before. I had a chat with someone and they suggested a format change. So I'm tweaking it a little bit. So what we're going to do is play pieces. So we'll play a little piece and then I'll interject some comments and we'll play another little piece. I'll interject some comments. We'll play another piece. And I'll interject some comments. So it'll be a little bit different. We'll see how it takes. We'll see how it rolls, how smooth it goes. And I think we'll enjoy this. This is from the podcasts from the Bible Projects app that they're doing, and they're on a 1-year walk through Torah. Okay, they're on a 1-year walk through Torah. Sounds like a Torah plan to me, right? And so this happens to be the very last podcast episode on the Exodus scroll that they have. There'll be a Q&R one after this, but this is the last on the Exodus scroll. And they brought Carmen in to talk about this particular topic on the test at Mount Sinai. So let's take a listen and we'll start us off and we'll see where we go from there.
I'm John Collins. This is Bible Project Podcast. And today, Tim Mackie and I get to talk with our friend and Hebrew Bible scholar, Dr. Carmen Imes. Carmen has been on the podcast before, talking about her book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. Because she's a good friend of ours and because she has an emphasis on the scroll of Exodus in her studies, we thought, how great would it be to sit down with her at the end of our journey through Exodus and debrief a bit about the things we've been talking about. It was wonderful to talk with Carmen, but it was also a little discombobulating, actually, because Carmen presents a few alternative interpretations to stories that we've been reading. Namely, the story in Exodus 19, where Israel comes to the base of Mount Sinai. God asks them to become ritually pure and prepare themselves to make a covenant with him. As Tim and I talked through that story, Tim made a compelling case for how Israel was meant to go up the mountain when the trumpets blast. And when they don't go up the mountain, they've failed a test. They failed to trust God. But Carmen is going to give us an alternative perspective on this story, in which Israel was never meant to go up the mountain, and they passed the test by fearing God and staying at the base of the mountain and sending Moses up instead as an intercessor. And so, as we listen along, as two Hebrew Bible scholars discuss a passage in the Bible and come to fundamentally two different perspectives on what it means, if you're like me, you might get a little flustered. But it's also good to remember that the Bible is meant to be read in community, and we're meant to challenge each other.
And isn't it a beautiful thing that we can sharpen each other and trade ideas? Like, isn't this what the rabbis did as they read scripture together? And well, it could be this and it could be this. And somehow they were able to sit with more unresolved tensions than we are. We want to know, like, well, which is it?
So let's prepare ourselves to sit in some unresolved tension around Exodus 19 and whether Israel was meant to go up the mountain. Thanks for joining us. Here we go.
That would help. Okay. So, Tim Mackie, John Collins, Carmen Imes. Great talk. Discombobulating. I like that term. And it's probably very appropriate. This is such a good opportunity to listen and hear two differing viewpoints. It really is a pretty rare thing, sadly, in my personal opinion, that we don't hear differing views together. It's really easy to find folks with differing views. Just walk down Church Row on a Sunday and look left and look right. But we don't very often see the two coming together. Okay? The biblical tension that is discussed, the opportunity for a differing way of viewing things, and maybe even start the broader discussion of what might also be affected as we move forward in hearing more stories and those patterns, right? Is there an opportunity to hear a different pattern? Or maybe even asking an even bigger question, is it actually a different pattern? And where else might it be echoed? Where else might it resonate? I love the reminder that the Bible is meant to be read, and I'll say studied, in community. We are meant to challenge each other. Carmen Imes with her deal. Isn't it a beautiful thing that we can sharpen each other and trade ideas? Isn't this what the rabbis did as they read scripture together? They look, it could be this and it could be this. And somehow they were able to sit with more unresolved tensions than we are. We just want to know, which is it? And maybe also we can really honestly be comfortable with each other if we differ. So with that, let's take a look at the next section in this. Again, I think you'll enjoy.
All right, Carmen Imes, thank you for joining us today in this conversation on Exodus.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. Let's see. So it's been a couple years ago that we actually interviewed you about the book of Exodus, even about the same section of the book of Exodus.
Yes.
And many people in our audience learned a lot from that, learned about your work, and really were excited about you. So we were excited to have you back on because John and I have been talking our way through Exodus, and we've stacked up some questions that we've been talking through and are excited to hear your perspective. Let's see. So maybe real quick, just as a quick bio, for those of you who haven't heard that interview in the archive, feel free. We encourage you to go do that. But real quick, tell us about yourself, Carmen, and also about recent updates in your family's life story.
Sure. So the three of us go way back. We went to Multnomah Bible College together back in the day. So that was our connection. And I'm a big fan of the Bible Project. I use the videos in all my classes. So I currently have students in an Old Testament history and literature class who are watching, I think, 40 Bible Project videos and taking quizzes on them. So they watch them outside of class. You guys kept making so many videos. I used to show them in class, but then there were so many that there was no time left for me to talk. And so now I've created an outside of the class dimension where they watch them and take quizzes on our learning management platform. And it's consistently their favorite thing about the class is that they just love engaging visually with the text. So that's fun. I am associate professor of Old Testament at Biola University. So having just moved down here from Alberta, where I was teaching at Prairie College for 4 years. So I'm in the thick of it with lots and lots of undergrads and love what I get to do.
It's great. And let's see, last time we had you on, we invited you to talk about both your dissertation and your book, Bearing God's Name. So we'll talk about some of those themes from that book today, but you haven't left the orbit of the book of Exodus. You're still there in other projects you're working on. Maybe talk about some of those.
Yes, I will be here for a while. I'm working on the Exodus commentary for the Baker commentary on the Old Testament series. So it'll be somewhere around 750 pages by the time it's done.
Wow.
It's a big project. And I am just thrilled to get to do it because it's giving me the space to work through things on a detailed level, to ask all the questions I want to ask and to chase down all the rabbit trails. And I love it.
Well, wonderful. When I learned that you were working on that project, as John and I have been talking through Exodus, racking up our questions, we were like, let's call Carmen. Let Carmen speak into some of these things. So, yeah, we are going to hang out at Mount Sinai as we did last time we had you on, but we're going to focus in on some specific things. But maybe real quick, for those of you who don't know about kind of your first series of projects on Exodus, you really zeroed in on both the moment of Israel making a covenant with God at Mount Sinai, and that what God calls them, as a title, but also what he calls them to be and do. So maybe kind of wrap that together. That's where we are. For this conversation, we're parked at the foot of Mount Sinai. So talk about those first paragraphs and moments of the story, how that connects to one of the 10 Commandments, and just talk about that.
Yes, great. As you mentioned, I wrote my dissertation and I wrote my master's thesis on 1 Peter 2, 9, and 10, which is an echo of Exodus 19. So I've really been in these chapters for 10 years now and just think they're fantastic. And I really believe that if we want to understand our identity and vocation as believers, we have to go back to Sinai because this is where it really is fleshed out. The people arrive at Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. They've crossed through the desert, and the first thing that happens is God speaks to them through Moses. And in Exodus 19, verse 3, he says, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And that moment is so important in Israel's development as a nation because it's defining who they are and what they are designed to do. What is the vocation that God has for them? And that phrase, my favorite phrase there is treasured possession, which is just one word in Hebrew, the word segala. And segala is not just a warm, fuzzy term that you might use if you really like somebody. It's a technical term used in treaty contexts to indicate a special treaty partner that has a representative role. And so God is appointing Israel to a special task of representing him among the nations. And that's before they get the law. It's, the second half of Exodus is known for having lots of laws. Before we even get to that, God makes clear, this is who you are. You as a nation are holy. You're set apart for my service. You represent me among the nations.
Excellent. Okay. So let's talk about how that connects to this language of kingdom of priests, and then also about carrying the name, I think, because then that tees us up for what we would like to do with you, which is actually to kind of walk through the steps of this narrative of how God shows up on the mountain and then how they come up to the mountain, and then are they supposed to go up it, but only Moses does. So there's things we'll talk about there, but all the way back here, just this is setting out the ideal picture, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah. So he calls them his treasured possession, kingdom of priests. And that's before he's given them any laws. But then he does give them laws. And those laws are the means by which they carry out the mission he's just given them to be the treasured possession, the segala, and the kingdom of priests. So why is kingdom of priests important? Well, it's very interesting that God would designate an entire nation as having some sort of priestly status. This would be totally unique in the ancient world, the idea that everyone in this nation is a priest, or that together they function in priestly ways. And so in just a few chapters, we'll meet the people who are designated priests in Israel's tabernacle, Aaron and his sons. And we'll see that they become like a visual model of what the entire nation is supposed to be and do. And so the high priest in particular is interesting to watch because he's the best dressed Israelite. He has this elaborate costume that he wears made with gold and jewels and fancy dyed fabrics and embroidered fabrics. And we're told in chapter 28, Exodus chapter 28 is where God gives Moses the instructions for how to make his garments. And we're told that he's supposed to bear the names of the sons of Israel over his heart. So he's got 12 gemstones on his chest. Each gemstone corresponds to one of the 12 tribes. As you know, there are actually 13 tribes. We don't count Levi in this because he himself is a Levite. So I presume the 12 stones are the 12 other tribes. But anyway, he is bearing their names. He represents them before Yahweh. And then he also wears some kind of golden medallion on his forehead. And that medallion is engraved in Hebrew with two words, Kadosh LaYahweh. And it's wholly belonging to Yahweh is the meaning of it. So it's setting him apart as somebody who's designated by Yahweh for this special task. So with that in mind, like we can then circle back to they're the kingdom of priests. If the high priest is representing them he stands between Yahweh and the rest of the nation as a representative, then they as a nation are in a sense standing between Yahweh and the rest of the nations, the rest of the world, and having that kind of mediatorial role. And presumably they have this, well, not presumably, God tells them they have this representative role. And so it's as if they are wearing God's name too. And so when we get to the 10 Commandments and God says, you shall not bear the name of Yahweh your God in vain, which is what it actually says in Hebrew, bear the name, nasa, using the same Hebrew word that's used to describe what the high priest is doing with names on his chest. He's nasaing the names, and they are supposed to bear the name of Yahweh. It seems clear to me that command is not prohibiting them from saying God's name or from using it as a swear word or using it in oaths, although we have to think carefully about how we speak God's name. The command is much broader than that. It's telling them, you are my representatives. I've put my name on you, so represent me well.
John, I realized I didn't invite you to say hi at the very beginning.
Hi.
I'm sorry. We're just dove right in.
I'm going to let you.
That's right. We got John diving right in. Because John was sitting back and listened to all that, which is really cool. Segala. Treasured possession. Not just this warm, fuzzy, like you're mine kind of deal, right? That it's a technical term used in treaty context to show a treaty partner that has a representative role. Boy, does that broaden the picture a bit, yeah? God is appointing the children of Israel. This is who you are to represent me, Yahweh, to the nations, okay? Remember, this is assigned, declared by God. They will represent God to the nations. One might add, for better or for worse, But maybe, in my opinion, better again. My opinion. He calls them a treasured possession and a kingdom of priests before anything at Mount Sinai in relation to the golden calf. That declaration is made well before that. Then the laws or the instructions, right, that she mentions are by the means by which they will carry out that mission to be who they are. A kingdom of priests. It's interesting since we have a first precedent here. Priests are not new by any means, right? But a kingdom of priests, that exists nowhere else. That is entirely, totally unique. Set apart people, together they will function in priestly ways. The sons of Aaron and the Levites, I like how she puts this, becomes a visual model of what's supposed to be and do. That Aaron is supposed to represent the people to Yahweh in a smaller scale to what the people should do as a whole to the nations, as if they are wearing God's name when they are looked upon, seen by the nations. And those instructions are showing the nations what they are supposed to see. I think it's no surprise that the first command has Nasa in it, or bearing the name in front of the nations. So don't take that task or appointment lightly. Represent me well. Represent me well. Okay. So let's listen to the next part, because they're going to get into a question that will start us off on our piece here.
You guys nerd out, and
We just
you
dove
guys
right
can-
in. So as John and I were talking about this, he had an interesting question that I wanted to hear your response to it. But John, it was about the way that the ideal of a kingdom of priests, and then there is a family of priests within the kingdom of priests. And are those two at odds with each other? You had a way of putting it that was a really helpful way of asking that question. Do you remember asking that question?
I don't know if I remember the exact question you're thinking of. What conversation was it from?
Well, it's the ideal. It begins with the nation of priests.
Yeah. Oh, and then become a nation with priests.
It's clear they later become a nation with priests.
Yeah.
And the question is that a lessening of an ideal?
Right.
Or is it possible to have a select priesthood and all of the nations and priests, and that's just a happy situation? Or are we meant to see some kind of idealism that all the people are priests?
So, Carmen, I'd love to hear your perspective on the priesthood of Israel. When I talk with Tim, when we talk about the priesthood, especially in our series on the priests, the royal priest, you make a pretty candid case that the priesthood is a concession. And that felt new to me, that it wasn't the ideal. And here at Sinai, Israel is called to be a kingdom of priests. So is the fact that not everyone in Israel is now a priest, is that a concession? Or is there actually something really beautiful and important about what the priesthood is doing within Israel? Or is it a little both? Like, how do you weave through that?
Well, let me first admit that I have not listened to all of your priesthood podcasts. So I don't know at what point.
It's really good.
Disagreeing. Of course it is. Of course it is. But you guys churn out content faster than I can keep up.
Mhm.
So at the risk of disagreeing with Tim, which I would hate to do.
No, feel free.
I think it's interesting that God calls them a kingdom of priests. And then before the golden calf incident, he's already giving instructions for how to build a tabernacle and what the priests are supposed to wear. So I feel like in terms of literary design, it doesn't seem like it's a concession there. Like God's anticipating the need for it, at least. And there's something really beautiful about the high priest and his elaborate garments that he wears that I think then help the nation to see what it is they're supposed to be and do on a broader scale.
Got it. So you're saying there's a harmony between the nation itself envisioning itself as a priesthood and then looking to one tribe set apart as a priestly tribe, as it were, like a visual cue.
I think we could look ahead to the New Testament and see a similar dynamic, because we talk about the priesthood of all believers, and yet we do have people who are set apart for apostolic, pastoral ministry, like in leadership roles. We have elders. I think the fact that we all have priestly access does not get rid of the need for there to be specialists.
Wow, that's a good point. Actually, and even more to the point would be Jesus is our high priest, but not to the exclusion of his followers being the kingdom of priests, right? Those two work in sync together. I've never really thought about that parallelism being parallel to Israel and its priests.
I probably thought about it because of my master's thesis, because I was hanging out in 1 Peter where he calls them a kingdom of priests, and kind of looking at that symmetry.
I think the conversation, John, that you're recalling, and actually it feeds into what we'll maybe get to if we get to the golden calf today, that Aaron is introduced into the Exodus story, as you know, as a concession to Moses's unwillingness to be God's mediator before Pharaoh. And so it's just interesting that Aaron is introduced into the story because of God's anger at Moses. And I've just always thought that seems really important, that that's when Aaron gets brought up.
Here, let me just throw out a thought with that, because in chapter 4, when Moses is saying, no, I really, really don't want this job. Like, I didn't sign up for this. I wonder if part of why God's angry is because he has already accounted for Moses' weakness as a speaker, and he's already provided a solution. And Moses is failing to trust him for it, because he says in chapter 4, verse 14, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you. And I think one way to read that is God already had this covered. And it's the reason God's angry is not that he needs to call Aaron. He had already called Aaron. But Moses is the one who's failing to trust that God's going to work this out and give him what he needs.
Wow. Okay. So what you're saying is that because he says Aaron is on his way, implied because I prompted him or something like that, to compensate for your fourth objection. But now with this fifth objection, you're just kind of ticking me off.
Yeah. I mean, you could take it as God's answering Moses' plea before he even prayed it, which is how I initially read it. But then as I was looking at it again and thinking about really the area of disability, like thinking about reading Moses' disability. The Lord said to him, who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Like, God knows Moses intimately and knows what sort of support he's going to need. The problem is that Moses doubts his own ability and needs to trust. So maybe Aaron was the plan all along.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So let's tuck that away when we come back to the developments later. But when we're at Mount Sinai, I appreciate your perspective that to be a kingdom of priests is not at odds with having a priestly tribe with high priests, that those can all work in sync together.
Okay, so some good stuff, right? So let's start here. Family of priests and a kingdom of priests, are those two at odds with each other? Is that a lessening of an ideal? Is there a concession here, right? These are the questions. And I enjoyed her point that before the golden calf incident, that God is already giving the designs for the tabernacle and the priestly garb. So in terms of literary design anyways, it doesn't seem like a concession. I like the point that Carmen brought up about to jump forward to the time of Yeshua and the apostolic era, and we have similar echoes, symmetry, resonance, in that although we're supposed to be representatives of God to the nations, right, as believers, we still have folks set apart for those kind of leadership roles, serving the body as an example to serve the nations. The thing I kind of got here was that at neither time are they called to save the nations, to turn them into priests, yet they are called to serve the nations we are all called to serve the nations as representatives of Yahweh. They are called a kingdom of priests. Yet the king, as in that line of kings, still wouldn't be for some time. There will be a king, hence a kingdom. Okay, so I'll go with that Yeshua is our king now, and that goes with his declaration of kingdom and the kingdom behavior that we've been talking about, like in the Matthew series, right? And is being under a king and addressing Yeshua in this when the service will follow and serving the nations, will we do that? I never heard saving there. And really, are we even really teaching service, serving, and representing God to the nations? Are we really doing that? I'm not sure. There's a good point made that even though we all have priestly access, that does not remove the need for the specialists, those appointed, gifted for certain roles. God makes a point of doing that for a number of people, including in the tabernacle build. Jesus is the high priest and king, dual role, as we have seen echoes with King David's actions if we're looking for a pattern in some things. Yeshua is the high priest, an intercessor to God on our behalf, everyone's behalf, the entire world. And as king, appointed by God for that role and given full authority by Yahweh, God empowers him. Do we see not just parallels per se, but parts of repetitive patterns? Symmetry, right? We're not replacements. We're developing the repetitive pattern. And then the point pops up about Aaron being a concession as a priest because God's miffed with Moses. And Carmen brings up another very compelling point. Aaron's already on the way. God had already covered that. Maybe the next test for Moses was, God has everything that I'm not doing or capable of doing covered. That's his part. Will I do my part? Will I do mine? God, we see in hindsight, has already counted for Moses. Could Moses have seen that or understood that? Often we forget that we are so far down the line from these folks that are actually learning and growing in the moment that they are in, that we forget that they lack what we already know, or at least think we know today in our time and culture, okay? We have so much hindsight. I'm not convinced it's really 2020, but we definitely have hindsight. God gets angry with Moses. And for me, I still ask, why should Moses have known that? What have we even seen in the story that would lead Moses to that conclusion? What, his life in Egypt? The um, the plagues? The miracles? His time with Jethro, those 40 years, maybe those are life lessons tucked in there that he's taught him that we're just not privy to in the narrative set before us. I try to remember that we are them and they are us, learning as they live. Okay. And I'm going to bring up a left field thought again about me turning stuff around. And Carmen brings up a very interesting thought about disability in respect to Moses. Okay. Then a response from God that we, I think, almost routinely overlook comes up in that response. Exodus 4, verse 11, and Yahweh said to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? I say this sometimes. Stop. Listen to what you're reading. Really read it. Hear it. And Yahweh said to him, who has made men's mouth? Or who makes dumb or deaf, seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? I guess a deeper question might be, how comfortable are you with that? That all of those are his. How comfortable are you with that? That's another thing to chew on. Okay. So let's go to the next section and we'll see some more stuff that I think pops up.
So let's move on to kind of the next step in this story then. So you read God's opening words to the Israelites through Moses. After that, God invites them to become covenant partners. So if you just listen to me, is his invitation. Keep my covenant and you'll be my representatives. So then God tells Moses, all right, we're going to make this official. I'm going to come down on the mountain in storm and fire and cloud. And on the third day, you're going to hear the ram's horn. And now I'm into Exodus verse 19, 12, and 13. And verse 13 introduces a really interesting detail where God says, on the third day, when the ram's horn is sounding, let the people come. And depending on what translation you read, you get a very different sense of what's happening. So the New Revised Standard Version says, let them come up onto the mountain, which is, I think, the most natural way of reading the Hebrew text there. But many of our other English translations say, let them come up to the mountain, not onto it, just to it. So John and I talked about this at length in the previous episode already, but maybe kind of tee us up. What do you see as the interpretive challenges in this story? Why these translation differences? And how have you sorted your way through this challenging story?
Yeah, well, it's challenging because the people say they don't want to go up the mountain. And so then God says, okay, you can't. And there seems to be a tension in scripture about whether it was a good idea or a bad idea for them to not want to go up the mountain. Mm-hmm. I remember first reading these texts in Bible college and thinking, what a missed opportunity. They could have gone up the mountain and they didn't. And now in Jesus we can. And so let's lean into this. I think I've shifted on this. I think I have a different opinion now than I did when I first read it. And I'm basing this opinion on the work of Michael Kibbe, who is a professor of New Testament and academic dean at Great Northern University. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on this conundrum. He did his doctorate in New Testament, so he was looking at the way Hebrews 12 recapitulates or recaps this event. So tracing it from Exodus to Deuteronomy and then into Hebrews. And he says that this moment, verse 13, is a test. So you've done a test video. You've talked about how God sets up these tests. He believes that this is a test designed to demonstrate Israel's fear of God, and that the proper response to an invitation to come up on the mountain where God is just is to say, no, we can't approach a holy God, that was the right response. And that this would then sort of galvanize their commitment to obey Moses as a mediator. So when they see that Moses can approach God and that they shouldn't, that shows both their fear of God and their trust in Moses as the mediator. And he traces that from Exodus into Deuteronomy and then on into Hebrews to kind of show exegetically how it works.
Okay. All right. So that's good. You're at a different place than where I was taking John to, which is wonderful. And this is why reading the Bible in community is so important, because we can learn from each other. So let me say back to you what I'm hearing you say. as you summarize Michael Kibbe. Because what God does say to Moses right before all of this is, listen, I'm going to come in a thick cloud. This is Exodus 19, verse 9. So that the people can hear when I speak to you, and so they can trust in you permanently. So I'm guessing that's where Michael is really, he sees that as a preview, that the goal of this is to set up Moses and the people's trust in Moses as a sole mediator. Is that right?
Yes, I can read you a little section here. This is from page 32 of his dissertation. So the chapter on Sinai and Exodus. He says, Israel has not consistently demonstrated proper fear of God in the events leading up to Sinai. So he's not confident of their ability to respond appropriately to his presence. So the test here is to see whether they will respond appropriately. He says, the human recipient's recognition of the divine presence and subsequent fear is a necessary precondition for moving forward in the story. So then he goes on, he surveys, there's 7 different options for how to reconcile these. How could God say this twice? Or is there are we translating it wrong? Or, what's going on? He talks about Sailhammer's approach to it, which I'm guessing you're familiar with, and shows why he doesn't think that works exegetically. But he concludes the contradiction between saying, don't come up the mountain, come up the mountain, is intentional and therefore necessary for the flow of the narrative. And it plays a crucial role in the fulfillment of God's broader purposes at the mountain, which, as I already said, were to show fear of God and to establish that mediation is necessary. And so when Moses intercedes for them, the narrative is showing that he's ready to move forward as the mediator God appointed him to be. And that's jumping ahead to chapter 32. When he intercedes for the people in chapter 32, that's the test of Moses. And God's presenting him with a test. Hey, should I destroy these people and start over with you? So they both get a test. Israel gets a test here at the foot of the mountain, and they say, no, we fear God. And then Moses gets a test. And in 32 with, hey, should I destroy these people and start over with you? And he says, no, I'm going to mediate. And so they both pass the test, and now we can go forward with the intended mediator.
Interesting. This is great. So I'm curious if you or Kibbe, so here were the other 2 things that compelled me in the direction of Sailhammer's interpretation. And that has to do with the narrative patterning of this story. Is massively patterned after Abraham's test on Mount Moriah, and then Adam and Eve's test on the Eden Mount when God showed up in the wind of the day. And there, Adam and Eve hide themselves from God's presence, and that's viewed as a sad fear of the Lord. It was a fear that came too late. And whereas Abraham's decision to go up the mountain and even surrender the life of his seed, even though he knew that God said, the nations will be blessed through my seed. So how does that work? So same kind of seemingly contradiction.
It seems to contradict.
Yeah. But there, for Abraham, it's his fear of the Lord is demonstrated by going up the mountain, not by staying away. So what do you think about how those narratives interact with each other? Because it also becomes a question of how do we interpret later stories when they're echoing earlier stories?
Well, this is going to totally throw a wrench in the whole thing. I have in the margin of Kibbe's dissertation, how does Middleton's reading change this? Because Kibbe says on page 43 that Abraham passes the test. So he sees the same parallel that you do.
Yeah.
Abraham passes the test because he fears God enough to obey him when doing so makes no sense in light of previous revelation. Israel passes the test because they fear God so much that they cannot do what he's commanded. However, Richard Middleton just released a book last year called Abraham's Silence.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited to.
You must read it. It is absolutely mind-blowing. So he argues that Abraham failed the test, that the test was, would you intercede on behalf of your son? Like he reads the Abraham story in light of the lament Psalms and the book of Job, where our questioning of God when he seems to be acting out of character is held up as a positive thing, that we should question God. And Abraham fails to do this. He just slavishly obeys in a case where there's a clear contradiction between promise and command. And so he shows exegetically, like he does careful work through the Abraham story in Genesis 22 to show why this is the case. And I'm not going to be able to do it all off the top of my head, but his basic point is Abraham is treating God like a Canaanite deity. that would require child sacrifice. He doesn't even question it. And what God wanted him to do was to intercede the way he interceded for Sodom and Gomorrah. When he intercedes for Sodom and Gomorrah, he gets down to, what if there's 10 righteous? But he doesn't go lower than that. And so Middleton thinks that here in Genesis 22, that God is asking Abraham to press in and find out that God would make a sacrifice just for one. Keep negotiating down or keep pressing in to know God better. So yes, Abraham shows faith, but his faith is misplaced. He shows that he actually doesn't know Yahweh as over and against other gods. So that throws a bit of a wrench in the parallel.
Okay, so that's interesting. I'll need to work through his argument. But when in Genesis 22, when God responds to Abraham and says, "Now I know that you fear God because you didn't withhold your only son."
Yep.
And
I know that you fear God.
So that
but you
is
don't
not
seem to
an
really know
affirmation.
me. Yeah.
I see.
You don't seem to really know me. So like God steps in to
Huh.
save Isaac because Abraham kind of failed to intercede for him. Like, okay, so you fear me. Okay, we're good. But I'm going to go ahead and save your son because otherwise the promise is in jeopardy.
So now we're 2 stories deep.
Yeah, right. We were supposed to be talking about Exodus here.
Well, but this raises an interesting question. When you have these narrative patterns, what does it mean to read one story in light of an earlier story? And how much do you import of the message of an earlier story into a later story? Is it just replay or is it a contrast? Does it invert? Does it reverse? And these are interesting questions because the narrators obviously want us to make these kinds of connections. And so the question is, how does the narrator want us to see the people at the mountain in some kind of analogous relationship to Abraham, in analogy to Adam and Eve? And if so, what's the comparison and what's the contrast?
And there's this clear allusion back to Genesis because they're not even supposed to touch the mountain, which echoes the language of not even touching the tree that Eve says. So
that's right.
There's some clear verbal parallels.
So you're persuaded by Kibbe that the people deciding not to go up the mountain and to say, Moses, you go up for us, is a sign of positive. It does have an interesting parallel to when God tells Moses in the same spot at the burning bush, don't come any closer. And that's a sign of his faithfulness, is by honoring, the divine fire.
So then the idea would be that Moses goes up on their behalf as a mediator, and God gives him the blueprints for the tabernacle, which is going to help provide proper boundaries so that they can approach God appropriately.
I see. Got it.
And there we go. Okay. So, what's this missed opportunity, or was it right? This tension in Scripture. Kibbe, right? You heard he said Exodus, Deuteronomy, Hebrews. He's getting this echo as it's walking through. He's building this case for this. It's interesting. The response is to have a healthy fear of God, and God regularly reminds him of that. Fear me, for I'm Yahweh. But they also need to learn about him and his character, and that's part of it goes with the trust, right? As we see him taking care. So in their response, in Carmen's words, it galvanizes them together, and they remember they are together, even in the golden calf incident, except for the Levites, of course, but that's later in the story. And that Moses is the mediator between them and God. And a prophetic line in regards to Yeshua, that he would be a prophet likened unto Moses, that he would be and is the ultimate mediator on the entire world's behalf. And we're not surprised to see Moses at the Mount of Transfiguration. Move ahead in the story, right? Their response is showing their fear of God and trust for Moses as their mediator. Now, do we see them contradict themselves as well? Yes, we do. But I'd be willing to wager that most folks, and certainly not me, would want to have our life account laid out in a living document of the followers of Yahweh. Um, and do we contradict ourselves in our relationship with God? Far too often. And it's just not in this document. Or maybe it is. I say it's an ongoing story. A healthy fear of God is a necessary precondition to move forward in this story, though. I'll agree. I might propose that we, in our time, especially with some Christian doctrines out there, that we really don't have a healthy fear of God. To quote a line from the Doobie Brothers, Jesus is just all right with me. Jesus is just all right. Oh, yeah. Jesus is just all right with me. Jesus is just all right. Oh, yeah. Maybe, just maybe, we don't have a healthy enough respect that we often accuse them of not having. We're them, they are us. Then we get to the Abraham test. That was a real upside down thought, and I loved it. So many things popped into my head as that interpretation unfolded. So many things. Yes, I've heard the Sunday school response of follow God no matter how ridiculous it might be. And that to this day doesn't sit well with me. I'll be honest, I admit it. Then Kibbe brings up, with Middleton, mind you, both in this, it brings up the character of God, and God will never act out of his character. That is how we can see his patterns, footprints, imprint on the stories of the Bible, whether there's names in there or not. So to push back on something because it does not seem to be in his character is a proper response. Abraham with Sodom was a good example. And then this event with Isaac, we see the terrible result with the impact on Isaac. I had the privilege of having a very good study with Skip Moen about Isaac and his life after this event, right? He is basically almost non-existent after this in scripture. And his relationship with his boys is flawed as well. Traumatic impact from a traumatic event. It's like PTSD on steroids because his father would not be sure that this was the right thing to do. Crushing and sad. And if we're looking for a pattern, maybe one of intercession on behalf of another or others is so very important and part of the greater test. That is a test, I know, that I fail way too often. There are multiple lessons here that I really liked. And the patterns or echoes that I was looking for, healthy fear of God, knowing God and his character, both I believe we should have strong understandings of if we're going to represent God. If we are to be priests, if we're facing the nations and representing God, we need to, one, teach a healthy fear and know what his character is. And when we do that, then all of our service will always fall inside of God's character and to teach that there is this healthy respect for God that we do as we serve the nations. I like this. I like this a lot. There'll be a part 2 to this because there's more to this. And there's a couple of nice little points, especially at the end, that we'll get to that I think we'll enjoy a lot. Okay. And so A point to ponder as we wrap this up. Um, this is actually a sad one when you think about it. As a general statement, and I do not know who Spencer is, at Noble Spencer. But the statement, fascinated by how the behavior of the people who took 3 pieces of pizza at a pizza party because they thought it would run out, and the people who took 1 piece for the exact same reason, is such a perfect encapsulation of American beliefs about community. Is the exact same reason. It's such a perfect encapsulation of the American beliefs about community. Might we throw ourselves in the hat? Don't want to do that. But it's definitely something to ponder. Thanks for being with us tonight on The Dusty Feet.